Legendary is a word people use too easily, but when Paul Newman finally spoke about the women who inspired him, his voice carried a weight that silenced rooms, as if he were confessing something he had held in his chest for decades. In that quiet moment, the camera seemed to catch more than memories. It caught regret, longing, and a tenderness that felt almost painful to witness. What he revealed was not a celebration of fame or beauty, but a trail of emotional truths that followed him all the way to his final breath. Paul Newman was known to the world as the blue-eyed icon who could do no wrong, the man who made rebellion look noble and kindness look effortless. Yet behind the charm and the awards, there was a restlessness he rarely spoke about. In private conversations, especially later in life when illness had begun to weaken his body, he admitted that the women who shaped him did so not because they adored him, but because they challenged him, disappointed him, or left wounds that never fully healed. He once said that inspiration rarely feels warm when it's happening. It feels like pressure. It feels like fear. It feels like standing in front of a mirror and not liking what you see. Long before Hollywood crowned him, there was his mother, Teresa, a woman with ambitions of her own that the world had little patience for. She wanted to be someone, to be seen, and Paul grew up watching her hunger for a life just out of reach. He later confessed that her quiet frustrations became his first lesson in emotional distance. He loved her, but he also learned early how love could feel conditional, wrapped in expectation and disappointment. That lesson followed him into every relationship, whether he wanted it to or not. When fame arrived, it brought women who admired him, desired him, and placed him on pedestals he never asked for. But admiration bored him, he said. What stayed with him were the women who saw through the image. Joanne Woodward was not simply the great love story the public adored. She was a mirror that never lied. Paul once admitted that Joanne inspired him because she frightened him. She was talented in a way that made him doubt himself, emotionally honest in a way that exposed his evasions, and strong enough to survive the moments when he failed her. Their marriage, so often romanticized, carried long nights of silence, unspoken resentments, and the constant shadow of his own flaws. He spoke about guilt with a softness that startled interviewers. Guilt over his first marriage, over the emotional chaos left behind, over children who felt the ripple effects of his choices. He acknowledged that the women closest to him often paid the highest price for his internal battles. Alcohol became a quiet intruder, not loud enough to scandalize, but persistent enough to erode trust. He admitted that more than once he saw disappointment in Joanne's eyes and knew he had become the man he once promised himself he would never be. There were other women, too, rarely named, whose influence lived in smaller moments. Fellow actresses who confided their fears to him late at night on distant sets, women who spoke about being overlooked, underestimated, or discarded by an industry that worshipped youth and obedience. He listened more than he spoke. In those conversations, he saw his own privilege reflected back at him, and it unsettled him. He later said that women like Elizabeth Taylor, with her fierce vulnerability and unapologetic emotional intensity, reminded him that strength and fragility often share the same heartbeat. He admired her courage, but also recognized how often Hollywood punished women for the very traits it celebrated in men. As the years passed and the roles grew quieter, Paul Newman began to talk about illness in a way he never had about fame. Cancer stripped away the illusion of time. During treatments, he reflected on how many words he had swallowed, how many apologies he delayed. He admitted that the women who inspired him most were often the ones he failed to protect, failed to fully understand, or failed to listen to when it mattered. That realization did not come with peace. It came with a kind of grief that sat heavy on his chest, especially in the stillness of night. Near the end, his voice softened when he spoke about legacy. Not awards, not box office numbers, but emotional footprints. He wondered aloud what the women in his life would remember most, the kindness or the absences, the love or the distance. In moments like that, The legendary actor seemed to disappear, replaced by an aging man reckoning with the cost of being admired by millions while sometimes missing the hearts closest to him. The camera would linger as he fell silent, eyes drifting somewhere far away, as if listening to echoes only he could hear. And in that silence, you could feel the weight of everything left unsaid, the inspiration born from pain, and the truth that even icons carry regrets that never fade. Beloved by audiences and respected by his peers, Paul Newman carried a calm exterior that hid a lifetime of emotional contradictions. And as he continued speaking about the women who inspired him, his tone grew quieter, almost fragile, as if each name and memory required a toll from his body. He admitted that inspiration for him was never about admiration from afar. It was about proximity to pain. The women who stayed with him in memory were the ones whose suffering he could not forget, even when the world applauded him. He spoke at length about Joanne Woodward during the years when her career threatened to eclipse his. Instead of pride, he felt fear, a fear he rarely acknowledged until much later. He confessed that watching her brilliance unfold forced him to confront a deeply buried insecurity. In private, he sometimes wondered whether he was loved for who he was or for the man Hollywood had created. Joanne, he said, inspired him because she never reassured him when he needed it most. She expected him to grow up emotionally, to face his jealousy, and to stop hiding behind charm. That expectation hurt, but it also changed him. There were moments he described with visible shame. Nights when he came home late, smelling of whiskey, knowing he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He remembered Joanne sitting silently, her disappointment louder than any argument. Those moments, he said, were when he felt most inspired and most broken. He realized then that love wasn't about being forgiven endlessly. It was about being held accountable. Few women in his life dared to do that, and those who did left scars that shaped his conscience. Paul also reflected on the women he watched struggle under the same spotlight that glorified him. He spoke of Marilyn Monroe with a heaviness that surprised those who heard him. He admired her vulnerability, her desperate desire to be taken seriously, and he confessed that Hollywood devoured her tenderness while pretending to protect it. Her tragedy haunted him. He said she inspired him by showing how cruelty could hide behind glamour, and how easily a woman's pain could be turned into entertainment. Her death was not just a loss to cinema in his eyes, but a warning he felt powerless to act on. As he aged, Paul became increasingly haunted by the women in his family. His daughters, growing up under the shadow of his fame, taught him lessons he never expected. He admitted that fatherhood humbled him in ways no role ever did. Watching his daughters navigate relationships, self-worth, and public expectations forced him to confront the ways he had once misunderstood women. He recognized echoes of his own mistakes in the men who hurt them, and that realization left him with a quiet rage and deep regret. He wished he had learned sooner what they taught him naturally. Illness changed the rhythm of his thoughts. During long hospital visits, he often spoke about time as something that betrayed everyone eventually. He said the women who inspired him most in those final years were the nurses, caregivers, and quiet companions who showed strength without applause. They reminded him of the resilience he had seen in Joanne, in his mother, and in so many overlooked women throughout his life. Their compassion, offered without expectation, stripped away his remaining illusions about success and legacy. He also revealed a lingering regret that stayed with him like a shadow. He wished he had listened more and spoken less. He wished he had asked better questions instead of offering solutions no one wanted. The women who inspired him, he said, did so because they demanded emotional presence, not performance. That demand terrified him early on and humbled him later. By the time he understood it fully, many of those moments were gone forever. As he paused, his breathing slowed, and his eyes seemed to search for something beyond the room. The weight of memory pressed in, heavy and unresolved, and you could feel that what he shared was only part of the truth, fragments of a larger emotional reckoning that still waited in the silence. Respected not just for his talent but for his restraint, Paul Newman admitted that the women who inspired him most often entered his life quietly and left without ceremony. Yet their impact lingered long after the applause faded. In the later years, when interviews slowed and the spotlight softened, he allowed himself to speak more honestly. And what emerged was a portrait of a man who learned far too late that strength often lives in endurance, not dominance. He spoke of his first wife, Jackie Whitty, with a sorrow that never fully healed. For years he avoided discussing that marriage, but eventually he confessed that it was one of his deepest regrets. Jackie, he said, inspired him by being the woman he failed before he even understood himself. She stood beside him when he was unknown, uncertain, and insecure. And when fame arrived, he was not prepared to protect what mattered. He admitted that leaving her fractured something inside him that no success could mend. The pain he caused her became a silent lesson he carried into every relationship afterward. Hollywood offered distractions, and Paul took them, though he rarely framed them as betrayals in public. In private, he acknowledged that temptation was less about desire and more about escape. Women who represented admiration rather than intimacy felt safer, because they asked nothing of him emotionally. Yet it was never those women he remembered. It was the ones who confronted him with his own emptiness that stayed with him, haunting and instructive. He recalled working alongside actresses who aged in an industry that punished them for survival. He spoke softly about Katharine Hepburn, her sharp wit and unapologetic presence, and how she inspired him by refusing to shrink for anyone. He admired her refusal to be liked, something he himself depended on for acceptance. Watching her navigate Hollywood on her own terms forced him to question how often he had benefited from a system that demanded women compromise while rewarding men for the same behavior. As illness tightened its grip, conversations turned inward. Paul described nights when sleep wouldn't come, when memories replayed without warning. He thought about women he never properly thanked, apologies he never delivered, and truths he buried under work. He admitted that success gave him many opportunities, but robbed him of emotional stillness. The women who inspired him, he realized, were often the ones who endured that absence, waiting for a version of him that arrived too late. Family pain resurfaced in those moments. He spoke of the loss of his son with a grief that never softened. The tragedy cracked something open in him, and he saw the women in his family carry that weight with a resilience that humbled him. He admitted that their strength during that period inspired him more than any performance ever could. They held the family together while he struggled to understand his own guilt and sorrow. In rare moments of vulnerability, Paul questioned whether his charm had been a shield or a weapon. He wondered how many women felt unseen while standing beside him, how many adjusted their dreams to fit into his life. That thought, he said, was harder to bear than any criticism he ever received. It forced him to acknowledge that inspiration is sometimes born from realizing the harm you've caused and choosing, however late, to sit with that truth. His voice softened further as he spoke, words trailing off as if weighed down by memory. There was no neat resolution in his reflections, only an acceptance that some debts of the heart are never fully paid, and that the women who inspired him would always remain part of his unfinished story. Beloved by generations who saw him as steady and unshakable, Paul Newman revealed that the women who inspired him most were often the ones who saw him at his weakest, when the mask slipped and the confidence drained away, and as health declined. He spoke more slowly, choosing words with care, as if each sentence might be his last chance to tell the truth without performance. He said inspiration changed shape as he aged. What once felt like admiration or desire transformed into something closer to reverence and regret. He described moments on film sets where young actresses confided in him, not about scripts or fame, but about fear. Fear of being replaced, of aging, of being misunderstood. He listened, he said, but listening did not always mean understanding. Looking back, He realized how often he underestimated the emotional toll women carried in an industry that celebrated him for simply showing up. Their vulnerability unsettled him, because it reflected a sensitivity he had spent years trying to hide in himself. He spoke about Jane Fonda with a mixture of admiration and discomfort. Her activism, her refusal to stay silent, inspired him while also challenging his own cautious nature. He admitted that he sometimes hid behind moderation when boldness was required. Watching her endure backlash, criticism, and personal loss made him question how easily men were forgiven for silence while women were punished for speaking out. That realization stayed with him long after the cameras stopped rolling. As time passed, illness stripped away his patience for superficial conversations. He found himself drawn to memories of women who embodied quiet endurance. Joanne, aging gracefully, yet carrying the weight of her own battles, became a source of both comfort and remorse. He acknowledged that her emotional labor often went unseen, even by him. He admitted that there were days when she was the stronger one, holding space for his fear while setting aside her own. Paul also reflected on the women he met through his charitable work, women whose lives bore little resemblance to Hollywood glamour. Their stories of loss, survival, and perseverance humbled him. He said they inspired him because they asked for nothing from him except honesty. In their presence, he felt stripped of illusion, reduced to simply being human, flawed, and finite. There were moments during these reflections when emotion overtook him. His voice would falter, eyes glistening as he admitted that he had often confused privacy with avoidance. He avoided difficult conversations, believing silence was kindness. The women who inspired him most were the ones who taught him that silence can wound just as deeply as cruelty. As his body weakened, Paul became acutely aware of time's cruelty. He spoke of nights filled with pain and memory, of replaying conversations he wished he could redo. He acknowledged that inspiration is sometimes painful, because it forces you to confront the cost of your choices. The women who shaped him did so not by praising him, but by surviving him. His reflections drifted into quiet pauses, the kind that feel heavy with unshed tears. There was no redemption arc offered, no attempt to soften the truth. Only a man, nearing the end, trying to honor the women who changed him by finally telling the story without adornment. Respected even in silence, Paul Newman reached a point where speaking about the women who inspired him felt less like confession and more like an act of responsibility. His body was frail now, his hands sometimes trembling, but his memory remained sharp in ways that surprised even him. He said that as death began to feel closer, the past stopped behaving like a distant place, and instead crowded the room with him, especially the faces of women who had carried emotional burdens he never fully acknowledged at the time. He spoke, again of Joanne, but this time with a different weight. Not the glamorous love story, not the celebrated partnership, but the quiet endurance of a woman who stayed when leaving might have been easier. He admitted that there were moments when she disappeared emotionally, retreating inward to survive. At the time, he mistook that withdrawal for strength. Only later did he understand it as exhaustion. That realization hurt him deeply. He said that knowing someone loves you is very different from knowing how much it costs them to keep loving you. He reflected on the women who never made headlines, the assistants, friends, and acquaintances who bore witness to his moods and silences. Women who noticed when he was distant, when he was drinking too much, when something inside him had gone dark. He confessed that many of them tried to reach him, gently, carefully, and he often brushed them off with humor or charm. Looking back, he recognized those moments as missed chances to grow, to choose connection over comfort. There was a long pause when he spoke about forgiveness. Not the kind given publicly, but the private forgiveness he hoped the women in his life had found for themselves. He worried that his absence, emotional or physical, had left wounds that never healed properly. He said that inspiration sometimes comes from realizing you were the lesson in someone else's life, and that realization can be devastating. The conversation turned to fear, a subject he rarely allowed himself. He admitted that he feared being truly known more than he feared failure. Women who saw through him inspired him because they threatened the illusion he had built. He acknowledged that masculinity, as he learned it, taught him to perform confidence while hiding vulnerability. The women who challenged that taught him courage in a language he struggled to speak fluently. As his health worsened, he began to say goodbye in subtle ways. Not dramatic farewells, but softer acknowledgments. A longer look, a squeezed hand, a thank you spoken with unusual intensity. He said those moments were often with women, because they seemed to understand what was happening without needing it explained. Their emotional awareness comforted him in ways he couldn't articulate. He admitted that regret does not announce itself loudly at the end of life. It settles in quietly, between breaths, in the moments when you realize there is no more time to become the person you once planned to be. The women who inspired him were present in those moments, not physically perhaps, but emotionally, reminding him of who he had been, who he had failed, and who he had tried, imperfectly, to love. His voice grew faint as he spoke, but the truth felt heavier than ever. There was a sense that he was approaching something final, something he had avoided naming for years. The room felt smaller, the silence longer, as if even the air was waiting for what he would say next. Legendary in the eyes of the world, Paul Newman no longer spoke like a legend as the end drew close. His voice had lost its strength, but not its honesty. When he spoke about the women who inspired him in those final reflections, it felt less like storytelling and more like leaving something behind, a truth meant to outlive him. He admitted that the closer he came to death, the more he understood that inspiration was not about what others gave him, but what he took from them without always realizing the cost. He spoke about the quiet moments near the end, when pain medication blurred time and memory slipped in without warning. Faces appeared in fragments. His mother with her unfulfilled dreams. Jackie standing beside a younger version of himself, hopeful and trusting. Joanne, tired but steady, still theirs. His daughters carrying both love and wounds shaped by his choices. He said those women returned to him not as accusations, but as reminders. They reminded him that love is not measured by intention, but by presence. There was a moment when he admitted something that startled even those closest to him. He said that if he could relive his life, he would speak less and listen more, especially to women. He believed too many of their truths were softened for his comfort, too many emotions minimized so he could continue being who he thought he needed to be. That realization brought him to tears, not because it was dramatic, but because it was irreversible. As his illness progressed, he became preoccupied with last words. Not the kind meant for headlines, but the kind whispered in private. He admitted that some women never heard what they deserved to hear from him. Gratitude, apology, recognition. He hoped they had found peace without waiting for it from him. That hope, he said, was both comforting and devastating. He reflected on the strange cruelty of being remembered as calm and composed when his inner life had been anything but. The women who inspired him knew the truth. They saw the doubt, the fear, the emotional distance, and still chose at times to stay. He said that staying is an act of bravery that is rarely celebrated, especially when performed quietly by women whose sacrifices go unseen. In the final days, when conversation became exhausting, he relied on presence more than words. A hand held, a shared silence. He noticed even then that it was often women who understood what he needed without being told. That understanding, he said, felt like forgiveness, even if it was never spoken aloud. When he finally fell silent, there was no grand statement, no neatly packaged wisdom. Only the lingering sense that his life, for all its success, had been shaped most profoundly by the women who challenged him, endured him, and inspired him through their strength and suffering. Their influence was not a chapter in his story. It was the current running beneath it, unseen but essential. Beloved though he was by millions, Paul Newman left this world without ever fully knowing how deeply his final confessions would echo. In the quiet after his passing, those who had listened closely understood that his true legacy was not found in the films, the awards, or the carefully preserved image of grace under pressure. It lived instead in the unresolved spaces he finally dared to name, the emotional truths he entrusted to memory rather than spectacle. The women who inspired him were never meant to be symbols or muses. They were witnesses. They saw the distance behind the smile, the exhaustion beneath the discipline, the fear hidden inside a man taught to be strong by never needing anyone. They carried parts of him when he could not carry himself, and long after he was gone, their influence remained woven into the lives he touched, quietly shaping the man the world thought it already knew. There was no final redemption, he claimed, no absolution he demanded. Only an understanding that love is complicated, inspiration is often painful, and regret does not erase what was real. His last reflections suggested something more haunting than closure, the idea that being remembered honestly is the closest thing to peace any of us might reach. Paul Newman did not ask to be forgiven. He asked to be understood. And in that understanding, the women who inspired him finally stood where they always belonged, not in the background of a legend, but at the heart of a human story that refused to end neatly, lingering instead like a quiet truth long after the screen fades to black.